Thank you all very much for coming today, and I'd like to share with you some ideas about the knowledge economy, which, as you know, is a dominant international policy discourse. And some key questions really will relate it to democratisation, distributive justice, or possibly domination. Okay, well, Gaby and Karina and Valerie said you're only allowed to speak if you provoke people. Don't come with a lot of bland, boring British stuff, you know. Get them going so we get a bit of a discussion going. So I'd like to start the whole session with some provocations. Now let's focus on the concept and the policy of the knowledge economy and ask what concepts structure the discourse. And what are the drivers? Are they economic? Are they all about wealth, growth, GDP, international competition? Or is there also a social agenda there about distribution of wealth, capacity building, developing human capital to improve people's lives? Or in many of the low-income countries, it's all about poverty reduction. And I think a very big question for many of us in this room is, what form does education take in the knowledge economy? What's the purpose of education in a knowledge economy? How is it being affected by the discourse? And a question that is vexing me a great deal on my travels is the question about whether a knowledge economy can exist without democracy. And later on in the presentation, I just want to, I'll show you what a massively global discourse this is. But it's taking place in very different socio-political contexts. So you have the social democracies of Sweden, but you also have areas like the Gulf states, where there are no democratic rights and very few rights for women, also saying they want to be a knowledge economies. So what does that tell us about knowledge? Is it completely socially decontextualized and some commodity that can be transferred across borders unproblematically? So some very big questions then about what's happening with knowledge. Has it been colonized by the cultural circuits of capitalism? Is it all linked now to capitalism? We had a very heated debate recently in a research committee here when we were told we were not to do any research unless it was funded. So we said, well, what about scholarship, writing, public speaking, being a public intellectual? Has all knowledge now been reduced to income generation? Has knowledge become overtly linked to the neoliberal values, and more recently in Britain, austerity? When I was in Sweden a couple of years ago to meeting, people were talking about neoliberalism, and I was saying we look back on neoliberal, the 1980s as a time of great beneficence, and now in fact we have extreme austerity, and people in Sweden were all saying, what is that word? How do you spell it? Is it with an O, an A, or a what? And now everybody around the world knows the concept of austerity. But has knowledge been linked to neoliberalism and austerity? And are some forms, and this is a huge question that's being debated by a whole range of different scholars, are some forms of knowledge and knowing misrecognised, unintelligible and absent? So for example, Bonaventura de Sousa Santos, the Brazilian academic, he works in Portugal, doesn't he? Has asked lots of questions about this, that is only knowledge from the global north valued and transferred across boundaries? So all the discussion we have had the last few days about policy borrowing, policy transfer, the mobility and transportability of knowledge, what's the direction of the flow? Is it all from the global north outwards? And then people like Sylvia Warby, the gender scholar, the feminist sociologist, has said, yes, we have all these concepts like the network society, and we use them as if they're gender neutral. But networks are very gendered, they're very racialized, they're very classed. So are there whole groups, communities, regions that are being excluded from the network society and from the knowledge economy because they do not have the right forms of capital? Okay, well, as I said, there is a global policy architecture. You only have to pick up any World Bank document, any OECD, and as Nafsika was saying on Monday, any EU policy document, and everybody's talking about the knowledge economy. And so what is it that they're saying? It's all about the economics of abundance. This annihilation of distance. We're all one big global academy, one global community. We can communicate across borders, across nation states. The state itself has been deterritorialized. So you have a whole series of developments like branch campuses, franchises. Some of the universities, just to give you an example, University of Nottingham has campuses in China, in Malaysia, many of the Australian universities, Monash, etc. They have branch campuses all over the world, in South Africa, in Asia. Wherever you go now, you see a whole range of providers who are not necessarily from that nation state. So knowledge has become, to use Zygmunt Bauman's phrase, liquefied, and it travels and it leaks into every crevice of people's existence. There's also this very powerful discourse that you'll see in the World Bank, for example, this investment in human capital. And it's a very linear, logical, rational set of arguments, an input-output model. You build up the capacity, the skills, the competences of the population, and therefore you will enhance economic growth. And a whole range of critics are saying, hold on, how come we've got such major graduate unemployment if that's the case? And I was reading yesterday in The Guardian, Sweden is even higher than Britain in youth unemployment, and graduate unemployment is becoming a huge concern in many places, that people make the investment, they get the credentials, they acquire the capital, and yet they can't exchange their capital in the labour market. So the human capital linear relationship between input and output is being challenged. And then it's all about metacognitive skills now. It's all about having the bigger picture. It's not about learning a trade or getting a set of competencies at a young age and reproducing them through life. It's all now about updating. It's about just in time rather than just in case knowledge, and it's about flexibility, this ability to keep changing according to the needs of the economy. And it's very, very future oriented. And we've been trying in CHEER for several years to engage in futurology, imagining the university of the future. And it is very difficult because there are so many different visions of the future. But if you look in the policies, it's all about building 2020 visions. It's all about building the knowledge economy of the future, the kind of society that we want to work towards. And these discourses are very certain, they're very authoritative, and they're full of exactitudes about what the future will be. And Valerie was asking you on Monday, I think, the question that is the present that we're living in, is this the future that we saw in the past? I'll leave you a minute to work out all those verbs. Did anybody predict the huge impact of the neoliberal agenda from the 80s onwards? Did anybody predict austerity? Even our Queen asked the economists here, why didn't you predict the financial crisis? Nobody knew it was coming. Or they said they didn't know it was coming. So this notion that you can equip people to deal with a future that is quixotic and unknown is highly problematic. Okay, well now let's move on to higher education, which is my area of interest. So higher education then has been reconstructed. There used to be a planned scarcity, and it was about elite formation. Look at any of the figures. Between the wars, I have to be very careful when I use that term because it can provoke all kinds of feelings. But between the wars in Britain, there was a 3% participation rate. It shot up in the 60s when Britain was booming, and before the oil crisis in the 70s, it shot up to 15% in the 1960s. And it's now hovering around the 40%. And the former Labour government had a goal for 50% participation. And Navsika told us all on Monday how the EU goal is for 40% participation rate. So it's been reconstructed from the scarcity value of just a few elite people to being a mass system. And it's now very demand-led. And it's a claimed form of citizenship. There is an entitlement now to higher education. And the citizen is now constructed as an economic maximizer. If you really want to do well in life, you get yourself a degree. And you have to be very self-interested, very agentic, very aspirational. But you have to be governed by a whole range of complex interests, your own self-interests. In terms of getting a better life. And the pamphlet, the little leaflet that I've distributed about an African project, so many of the young people we interviewed in Ghana and Tanzania framed their aspirations for higher education in terms of Philip Wexler's concept of becoming a somebody. How could you differentiate yourself from the masses? You differentiated yourself via credentialization. You got your professional status, you became a somebody. And there are very mixed drivers globally as to why people participate in higher education. Some it's for social change and social responsibility, but a lot it's for their own benefits. So the citizen then is being asked to be a self-maximizer, but also aspire to nation building and wealth creation. So it's quite a heavy agenda here. As Herta Bista joked, it's now almost a civic duty to aspire to higher education. You're in dereliction of your civic duty if you are not ambitious. And you probably have seen here, there's a very strong discourse of around welfare and benefits, and this notion that Britain is full of benefit cheats, all these people who live off the state, and this is the kind of the counter. They're not contributing to the wealth, they're drains on the wealth, and the citizen, the ideal citizen is the one who educates and contributes to the economy. Okay, now let's go back to this notion about the global academy, and there is a knowledge race. Everywhere I go, whichever region I'm in, everybody wants to be a leader in the knowledge economy. Now, if Navsika told us about the European Union, the Lisbon Council back in 2000, and at that time, there was a binary. There was the US, and the European Union was so worried about playing catch-up. So they developed, the European Union thought, let's have the United States of Europe, therefore we can compete with the US. And the Lisbon Council, which later became the Lisbon Treaty, was all about making the European Union the most competitive and dynamic, knowledge-based economy in the world, etc., etc. You know, we're going to show them. We're going to get the Swedes, we're going to get the Brits, we're going to get the Germans, put them together, wow, what a Gestalt. Meanwhile, while there's this gladiatorial battle between the US and the EU going on, the ASEAN nations rose up. And much of the literature about higher education, you will hear that it is the Asian century. So who are the countries that are really developing their research, their investment? It's not Britain, it's not Sweden, it's China, it's India. And more recently, newcomers to this, like Malaysia, Indonesia is another one. So the ASEAN region is really building. And why? Why do they want to become big knowledge economy? Well, I think they're a bit tired, a bit fed up with being the global factory for all our cheap t-shirts and trainers and whatever. They want a better life. And you look at you keep your eye on the league tables, you'll see the universities that are rocketing, racing to the top, entering from nowhere, are from Asia. And the European universities are dropping. And then there are the Gulf states. And I know several of you are either from there, or you've worked there, or lived there. But last year I spent time in Dubai, and they are aspiring to be the knowledge hub, the universal knowledge hub. They have a knowledge park. They had 27 branch campuses in Dubai alone. Qatar is another example. Masses and masses of oil wells to invest in the big infrastructure. And as I sat listening to all of this, sheikh after sheikh taking the stage saying, we are going to be the knowledge hub for the whole of the universe, I sat and I thought, are there democratic rights here? Do women have rights? In many of the Gulf states there isn't even maternity leave, and in some of the Gulf states women have only just got the vote. Kuwait, women had the vote in 2006. Meanwhile, we're being told that these are going to be global hubs. So what kind of knowledge are we talking about when we talk about the knowledge economy? Is it completely socially decontextualized? Does it have any relation to human rights, citizenship, democracy, etc.? And then another area, which I'm sure Daniel can fill us in more about later, is Latin America. You hear all the time about the rising powers, Brazil, Chile, etc., Mexico, Nicaragua, the rising powers that have moved from agriculture to industry, and they now want to become knowledge economies. So this old fight between the EU and the US has opened up, and there are a lot of new players, a lot of new competitors, new providers in the global knowledge economy. Okay, so what does knowledge do? Okay, well what do the documents tell us it does? It's all about progress, and it's all about innovation, creation, and applying knowledge. So there's a massive, massive agenda in Britain now about knowledge transfer, knowledge exchange, or knowledge mobilisation. So when you get any kind of grant from the government for research, you have to demonstrate impact. So it's not enough to write a few academic papers or the odd book. You have to show how you have changed policy, practice, enhanced the economy, you've changed community organisations, you have to have social, economic, community, policy impact. So knowledge has to be applied now, which raises all kinds of questions about the humanities. And there are major debates going on in many countries, in Britain and Australia, Canada, etc., about the future of the humanities. And you hear the neoliberal managers that Valerie described so beautifully on Monday saying, well, why have we got philosophy departments? They don't generate any research income. What's the point of teaching languages? No, don't need, everybody speaks English. So the humanities are seriously under risk because knowledge is being reduced to its application. It's seen as a national economic asset and the basis of national competitive advantage. When I grew up, there was the Cold War and it was the arms race. Now it's the knowledge race. Who can innovate more rapidly? Who can be more advanced in knowledge? And there's this ghastly term you hear all the time, innovation. Innovation. And it's largely to do with the science subjects. It's used in relation to the science subjects, which again, a lot of people in the arts will say, what about creativity rather than innovation? And then you get the economic argument used again. In Britain, we're told, well, we should really keep literature and theatre because we generate a lot of income from our tourism in London with all the theatres. So everything has to be justified with an economic argument. The other point about what knowledge does is it's supposed to drive social and geographical mobility, and it's important to ask for whom. Who is getting these opportunities? And then there's this insurance that it's against public-private property, and there's a big debate about whether knowledge should be private, should be owned by the individual, or whether knowledge is a public good. And this has fostered a lot of debate about who should fund higher education, who benefits. Is it the whole of society, in which case should the taxpayer fund it? Or is it the individual who's getting economic competitive advantage, therefore he or she should fund it? So a lot of debate then about public-private ownership. And then there's also that view that the more educated citizenship is much more democratic because they're more likely to vote, they're more likely to make critical decisions, they're less likely to be prejudiced, have nasty, unpleasant views because they've been educated out of them, etc. So there's all of that debate, the citizenship debate. And then in the European Union, you'll see an awful lot about social cohesion and peace. And when you think, I know Sweden has a whole history of neutrality for which we have the most enormous respect in Britain, because with us, if there's a war anywhere, we're in there, you know. And we're told all the time we have to close our hospitals, our schools, make people redundant, we can't afford to pay the nurses, etc. And yet something happens in Libya, billions of pounds can suddenly be found to get all our armed services out there. So there's a very powerful debate really now about that war is archaic, this is not what modern society should be doing, and the more global networks we have, the more global relationships we have, the more social cohesion and the more likely we are to be peaceful. Okay, so how is it all operationalising? Well, I think you know a lot about how the network society operates. It's through a lot of it through technology. The network society, connectivity. It's about rethinking relationships between education, learning and work. And do take a look at Michael Young's work on this. He's a former colleague of ours at the Institute of Education, and a really lovely thinker. But at one time, I mean, when I was young, I studied what I was interested in. Now a lot of young people have to be very strategic in their choices in terms of studying something that will get them employment in the labour market. So a whole change of relationship. And this has led to some very big concerns that perhaps universities, higher education, are just training grounds for industry now. That they're no longer areas of critical knowledge, they're no longer places that produce critical citizens, but they're all about producing workers. And then this business that you're never, ever fully upskilled. You have to keep reinventing yourself, keep updating, this lifelong learning or perpetual training. You have to keep registering. Some of the professions now, you lose your registration if you don't upskill every 3 or 4 years. So this notion that knowledge is fixed and stable, and you can acquire it at the age of 20 and take it through life, has been completely disrupted. And then this, the competencies discourse. Now another person I think you would very much enjoy reading is Michael Peters, who writes very eloquently about the knowledge society and about neoliberalism. But we have a very strong competencies discourse now. And I know Barbara and I rant about this, don't we, that doctoral training in Britain has been reduced to competencies. What competencies can people demonstrate? Not what sort of intellectual endeavours they're engaged in, but what can they demonstrate? And everything is about output and something that is recognisable. And then there's this whole area of diffusion and openness, often being rehearsed in Europe around open access publications, that everything is out there now. You think of the social media. There's no boundaries between the public and the private. What's happening in your life, you put on your Facebook, and the whole world can see it. And the same kind of thing is happening with publications, with journals, that everything has to be open. And of course, the term that you hear all the time about the knowledge economy is global convergence. We are all aspiring, or we are all told to aspire to the same things. And that is largely to do with the league tables and economic competition. And then lastly, a massive, massive impact on higher education is the widening access, participation, and resulting massification. So if you want to develop a knowledge economy, you've got to get more people in. And one of the problems is that the performance indicators is often they're often quantitative. So countries all around the globe try and get more people into higher education, and their success criteria are to do with numbers. So if you get more women in science, great. We've now not got a gender problem anymore. But they don't look at the curriculum, and they don't look at what people are actually gaining access to. So, what has been very, very important, and this is sort of Valerie's terrain, is the psycho aspects, the affective aspects. How do you ensure that people sign up for the project of the knowledge economy? How do you make sure they participate and collude, and that they want what the state tells them to want? And this has been very beautifully theorised by Valerie Walkerdine. This idea that you have to align people's personal desires, personal projects, personal aspirations with the needs of the economy. So you get everybody to aspire to higher education, to bettering themselves, to upskilling, to updating, because that is good for the economy. Well, it was until the economy crashed, and then people's desires then got realigned. Working class young people were told, well, it's good to do an apprenticeship, don't bother about university. So that people are constantly being worked on by these discourses, being told what to want. But the pressure has worked. And if you just look at the statistics about how higher education has moved, from 1960 globally there were 13 million, by 2009 170 million. So there's been a stampede, there's been a global hunger for more higher education, and it is now beginning to slow down. But again, look at where it's really taking off. And the largest higher education sector in the world is China, and it's getting bigger by the minute. And they are competing with Europe. They're running programs in English, they're developing their postgraduate, they have masses of research funding, they offer scholarships, particularly to people from low-income countries. So it's moving. But the growth is slowing down. The growth up to 2009 was 5 to 6%, and then it plummeted to 1 to 2% in 2012. And if you think that could be one of the effects of austerity, that people were looking at higher education thinking it's extremely expensive, is it worth the investment? Mass graduate unemployment, why should I get into all that debt? Can I afford the fees? Is it worth it? So it is changing, the pattern is changing. So there's a big question that's being asked here. Has the economic crisis produced a democratic crisis? And are we returning to the elite mode of the past? Because now people can't afford it and they are questioning its value. There's a lot of debate here about the graduate premium. We were told when fees were first introduced that a graduate would earn more than £400,000 over a lifetime than a non-graduate. And then it was revised down to 100,000 over a lifetime. And now so many graduates can't even get jobs. So there's no graduate premium. And a lot of people are evaluating so-called knowledge economy very strategically. Okay, I'd like to move on very quickly now to some empirical work, and this relates to this widening participation agenda. And you have leaflets about this project, and I'll go very quickly because we're going to run out of time. But basically it was in Ghana and Tanzania, and it was mixed methods, looking at, we did quantitative and we did qualitative data collection, but we did it in relation not just to access, but also to achievement and completion and retention. And we didn't just look at one structure of inequality, so we used intersectionality methodologically as well as theoretically, and I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment. But we looked at gender, age, and socioeconomic status. You can't really call it class in sub-Saharan Africa, because that's not a discourse that's used a great deal. It's much more about poverty. Okay, so we looked at 4 programs of study in 2 public and 2 private universities. We collected quantitative data via 100 equity scorecards, and all of this is on our website. I'm not going to show you all the scorecards, but they're all on our website. And then we collected 200 interviews with students, life history interviews, and 200 with staff and policymakers. And as I say, intertextuality was a guiding theoretical concept. Now I'm going to start off with just one equity scorecard from Tanzania. And I'll ask you just to look at one line now. If you look at the BSc in engineering, okay? Now that has had vast amounts of sponsorship from the Carnegie Corporation of New York to get more women into engineering. So there have been scholarships for women, access courses, bursaries, empowerment courses, you name it. There's been a massive intervention. Consequently, the participation rate has shot up to 25% from nothing. And when I lectured in countries like Japan, they've been stunned. You know, engineering course with 25% women, that's amazing. That's good, great news, fantastic. The numbers have changed. Now start intersecting gender with other structures of inequality. And move along the columns to the last 3. When you intersect gender with socioeconomic status, you'll see that only 1.36% of the women come from poorer communities. You look at it in relation to age, only 1.17. And then if you intersect gender, socioeconomic status, and age, there are no women whatsoever. Statistically insignificant, as our quantitative colleagues would say. So, who are the women who are getting in on all the affirmative action programs? Are they from the more privileged communities? Are they the people, the women who've been to private schools, who've had a lot of social capital? So it's important, a very important message here is when we're looking at affirmative action, looking at widening participation, looking at structures of inequality, it's important to intersect them, because sometimes a success story for one can disguise the exclusion of other groups. And then very quickly looking at Ghana, you'll see that the only place where women, the poor, mature women, are actually represented in any number is in the B.Ed for primary. One of the degrees with the lowest exchange rate in the labour market. Primary school teachers earn nothing in Ghana. But that's where the women go, the older women go. Okay, so just to say that statistics are changing. Now, people like Michael Young have said, what are people getting access to? When we're talking about this fantastic knowledge economy, opening up opportunities to so many new people, yes, some of the statistics might be changing. What are they actually getting access to? And as Valerie was saying on Monday, gender is often treated, particularly in the international community, as a noun. So you count more women in, end of story. Yeah? Get the grant from Carnegie, sign off. We've done it now, don't need to worry anymore. In Britain, there's nothing at all in higher education policy about gender. Why? Why not? Because over half the undergraduate students in Britain are now women. So it's not seen as a problem. So gender is reduced to a noun. But let's just look at it how it operates as a verb. I'm looking at Ghana, and you worked with John yesterday on the Ghanaian schools. And we had all of that evidence in our data about violence, gender violence, etc. It was all there. Okay, so out of the 100 students, 17 men and 9 women saw anything to do with gender difference as preferential treatment for women. It's not fair. They get all the help. They get affirmative action. They get all the attention from their male teachers, etc. So women were constructed as this special needs case who ate up all the resources. Women also couldn't win. If they failed, if they dropped out, they didn't do well, it was seen as evidence of their lack of academic abilities, or lack of their preparedness for higher education. However, they weren't failing on the whole, where women and poorer students were doing quite well. So how did that get conceptualised? Not, isn't it great, women are getting the opportunities? No, that was attributed to their favoured position. And the fact that they were all trading sex for grades. This is what we heard again and again and again. And the women were constructed as corrupt, fraudulent learners. They weren't entitled to higher education. They got in there because of all their antics. They were seen very much as strategic agents. So sexual harassment was widespread. And it's widespread here, as Carolyn was telling you on Monday. It's not that it's an African problem. But the attribution of blame was in the direction of the women. So when we had our dissemination seminars in Ghana, in Accra, for example, the male academics would stand up and say, it's because they engage in indecent dressing. It's their fault. They wear short skirts, tight tops. What do they expect? So it was all blamed on the women. They were using their corporeal style to manipulate this essentialized male desire. The men had no control over their desire, and it was all the women's fault. They were manipulating it. And this sexually transmitted grades was what we kept on hearing about. And the women were doing well because they were having sex with the male tutors. And that was the discourse. So that is what women are entering. Okay? The numbers might be changing, but that is the gendered rationality of higher education. And Carolyn gave you a lot of examples of the same sort of things here in Britain. So I don't want to objectify Africa and saying, oh God, it's all in sub-Saharan Africa, aren't they backward? That's not what I'm saying. It's absolutely everywhere, and there are countless reports on this. So, just to try and sum up now, there is a very profound message that somehow democratisation will be increased by enhancing representational space. Count them in. Lift the wire, let more people in, drop the wire. Great, we have equality, we have parity, we have participation, we have an increased engagement in the knowledge economy. But there are these norm-saturated policy narratives that just suggest all you have to do is add more underrepresented groups. In Britain, the focus is on working class communities. Just put them in. You don't overhaul or review what it is that they're being offered, but just count more of them in. And what will happen is you get a form of distributive justice automatically. Or as the World Bank talks about, smart economics. Yeah? Get more women into education, and higher education is a form of smart economics, because then you get more economically active people, and of course the old misogynistic view that women are there to support families. So there's that old UN slogan, educate a woman, you educate a whole family. So a woman does not have an entitlement to education for her own self. She has it because it is her moral duty then to reproduce and educate the family. So, and that is very, very dominant in a lot of policy discourse. There's also this sense that there'll be a sort of automatic transformation of the organisation and epistemic transformation. Knowledge will change because different people are engaging in it. All highly problematic. Okay, but there are so many problems here, and these are just a few. That as soon as women do participate, there are new hysterias about feminisation, about whether they're up for it or not. There's an awful lot of policy focus on disadvantage. There's very little theorisation of power and privilege. So we look at all the people, treat certain people as remedial groups, who need all these special help, etc. But we don't look at the dominant groups to see how privilege is being reproduced. So, when there are any redistributive measures, like affirmative action, that immediately is seen as contamination, polluting standards and quality. And it's seen as a threat to excellence. And then so, just to say then, that access is not an end in itself. As Michael Young has said, it's not like voting. Once you've got the vote, that's it. Once you've got access, it's just the beginning. And what is getting very noticeable is that the knowledge economy is highly invested, it's situated, and it's exclusionary. And we've moved now, and this is a very, very quick last slide, we have moved now from the access, the widening participation, the counting more people in, to looking at a much more nuanced set of concerns. So we've gone from access to looking at cognitive and epistemic justice. So it's not just about counting the actual bodies in, but let's look at how certain groups engage with knowledge. And as Miranda Fricker has said, certain social groups have been wronged in their capacity as knowers. They suffer a credibility deficit, a lack of rational authority. And you saw that in the data coming from Ghana, that the women students were being wronged as knowers. And Miranda Fricker talks about two types of injustice. Testimonial injustice, where there's a deflated level of credibility to a speaker's word, like rape victims, for example. Or Sharia law, where one man is equivalent to 4 women's words in law. So certain groups are not believed, they're not taken seriously. And then hermeneutical injustice, where there's a gap in collective interpretive resources. So, take for example all these concepts and constructs that have entered the language in the last decade, like sexual harassment, like marital rape, date rape, bullying at work, etc. These weren't concepts that were used 10, 20 years ago. But the activities existed, we just didn't name them. So if you silence something, if you don't allow it to be researched, you're therefore perpetuating this gap in the collective knowledge. So, finally then, democratisation in higher education is not access to knowledge, knowledge production systems, and organisations that have been monopolised and dominated by the elite. That is not democratisation. It's not about transferring a lot of socially decontextualised knowledge across the world, ignoring all the contributions from the South, etc. It's not about reducing knowledge to its exchange value, commodifying it. And it should not be about overlapping social and epistemological hierarchies. So the people at the top of the knowledge economy are those with all the power in society. And the most powerless members of society have the least input into the knowledge economy and benefit the least. But it could involve, and this is where our futurology comes in, it could involve discovering new conceptual grammars to include social identities and cognitive and epistemic inclusion. So I'm not talking about getting people in, I'm talking about epistemic inclusion as well. And it could contribute, we need maybe to have a bigger discussion when we're talking about growth and income, and open it up, and not just talk about wealth creation, but let's also talk about wealth distribution. Okay, thank you very much.